Chicago, a city known for its towering skyline and restless heartbeat, had just begun to stir when Judge Eleanor Johnson rose from her bed. The sun had not yet climbed above Lake Michigan, and the streets outside her apartment window were quiet, holding their breath before the daily rush began. For Eleanor, mornings were sacred. They were moments of calm before a day filled with decisions that could shape lives and bend the course of justice. Eleanor was no ordinary woman. At 51, she carried herself with a grace that spoke of decades of discipline and compassion. Her skin, a deep shade of mahogany, glowed with a warmth that reflected her spirit. She was known in the courts not only for her sharp legal mind, but also for her fairness and unwavering loyalty to the law. To her, justice was not a concept. It was a duty, a responsibility, a calling. Her colleagues admired her. Her community respected her. But what set Eleanor apart was her kindness. She treated every case, whether it involved a petty theft or a serious crime, with the same level of seriousness. She listened to people. She tried to see the human being beneath the mistakes. She was the kind of judge who reminded everyone that the courtroom was not just a place of punishment, but also of hope, fairness, and truth. That morning began as so many others had. Eleanor awoke before her alarm, as though her body instinctively knew the rhythm of her duty. She brewed a small cup of coffee, the aroma filling her modest but well-kept apartment. She flipped through the day's case files spread neatly on her dining table, her eyes lingering on notes scribbled in her careful handwriting. Each page told a story of conflict, of people caught at the crossroads of choice and consequence. She studied them not with detachment, but with genuine care. By 7 o'clock, Eleanor was dressed for the day. She wore a navy blue suit, pressed and elegant, a symbol of the dignity she carried both inside and outside the courtroom. Her hair, streaked with gentle threads of silver, was pulled into a neat bun. Before leaving, she paused in front of the mirror, not out of vanity but as a quiet ritual, reminding herself that she represented more than just herself. She represented the law, the people, and a legacy of perseverance. Stepping outside, Eleanor was greeted by the crisp Chicago air. The city was waking up, buses rumbling, pedestrians hurrying, and the hum of traffic beginning to rise. She walked toward her silver sedan parked at the curb. The car was not flashy, not extravagant. It was practical, dependable, just like her. She had never been the type to flaunt her success. Her pride came not from material things but from the knowledge that she lived her life with integrity. Driving through Chicago's wide avenues, Eleanor reflected on her journey. Born and raised in the city's South Side, she had grown up during a time when opportunities for black women in law were scarce. Yet she persevered. She studied late into the nights, worked tirelessly through law school, and slowly carved a path that led her to the bench. Every obstacle she had faced, every slight, every doubt cast upon her, had only strengthened her resolve. As her sedan moved steadily along the road that morning, Eleanor was unaware that the calmness of her routine was about to be shattered. What awaited her was not just another day at the courthouse, but an encounter that would test not her knowledge of the law, but her dignity as a person. The city around her bustled into life as she drove toward downtown. She kept her speed moderate, as always, never rushing, never reckless. Traffic lights reflected across the polished surface of her car. To Eleanor, it was just another morning, ordinary, predictable, safe. But sometimes, life has a way of turning the ordinary into the extraordinary. Sometimes, in a single moment, all the years of effort, of honor, of service, can be challenged by the prejudice of a stranger. And that stranger was closer than she realized. Behind her, a police cruiser had appeared. The presence at first seemed coincidental, just another vehicle on the road. Eleanor glanced briefly at her rearview mirror and then back to the road. She had nothing to hide, nothing to fear. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew she had always respected the rules of the road. Yet the cruiser did not pass her. It lingered. Its shadow stretched across the lanes as it followed her. Eleanor's eyes flickered to the mirror again. The flashing lights had not yet come on, but there was something heavy, unsettling, about the way the police car trailed behind her. She adjusted her grip on the steering wheel, steady, cautious, telling herself it was just a routine patrol. But her instincts told her otherwise. That morning, Judge Eleanor Johnson had no idea that her life's work, her principles, her identity, were about to be dismissed in the eyes of one man who saw not a judge, not a woman of law, but only the color of her skin and the car she drove. And in that moment, as the city's skyline loomed in the distance, the stage was set for an encounter that would expose not only the prejudice of one officer, but the resilience of a woman who had dedicated her life to justice. The morning light stretched long and golden across the Chicago streets as Judge Eleanor Johnson's sedan glided smoothly along the road. Her car's engine purred quietly, a steady rhythm that matched the calmness of her thoughts. To her, the drive to the courthouse was often a moment of reflection. It was the bridge between her private world at home and the public duty that awaited her in the city's marble chambers of justice. The streets were familiar. She had traveled them countless times, each turn etched into her memory. Eleanor never drove fast, never pushed the limits. She knew too well the dangers of recklessness, not just on the road but in life itself. To her, discipline was not a burden but a choice, a principle. She obeyed the laws of traffic with the same respect she gave to the laws of the courtroom. But on that day, something unusual lingered in her rearview mirror. First, it was easy to dismiss. Police cruisers were common in Chicago, their black and white frames weaving through traffic as guardians of order. Eleanor had no reason to worry. She was a judge, a woman who had dedicated her entire life to the very system these officers represented. She had nothing to hide. Yet the car behind her did not pass. It stayed close, too close. Her eyes flickered to the mirror once more. The officer's silhouette was faint but visible, his gaze seemingly locked on her. Eleanor felt a tightening in her chest. Not fear, but unease. She knew enough about the world to recognize when attention was no longer casual. And then it happened. The red and blue lights flashed to life, flooding her rearview mirror with a sudden urgency. The siren wailed, sharp and commanding, cutting through the hum of the morning traffic. Eleanor's hands tightened on the steering wheel. She slowed her sedan and guided it carefully to the shoulder of the road. Her thoughts were calm, deliberate. She reminded herself that she had committed no violation. Her car was properly registered. She was driving under the speed limit. She had signaled every turn. By every measure of the law, she was blameless. But the officer who stepped out of the cruiser did not approach with the measured caution of an investigation. He came with something else, a heavy, unquestioned certainty. As Eleanor watched him in her side mirror, she noted his posture. It was not neutral. It was accusatory, bristling with authority that seemed eager to be tested. She could not yet hear his words, but his movements spoke volumes. He was not walking toward a driver. He was marching toward a suspect. And in that moment, Eleanor felt the sharp sting of realization. Somewhere on the police radio that morning, a report had gone out about a stolen car. Somewhere, a description of its make and color had been broadcast. And somewhere in the mind of this officer, the sight of her, an accomplished black woman driving alone, was enough to collapse all doubt. Her car, her skin, her presence. Together, they became his evidence. He did not begin with a request for license and registration. He did not begin with questions, with curiosity, with fairness. Instead, he began with commands. Strong, unyielding commands that presumed guilt. He ordered her out of the car, his voice rising, sharp and hostile. Eleanor's heart pounded, not with fear but with indignation. She had spent her life upholding the law, defending the principles of fairness, protecting the rights of every citizen who entered her courtroom. Yet here she was, being stripped of those very rights on the side of a Chicago road, reduced not to her identity as a judge, but to the assumptions of a man who saw her only through the narrowest lens of prejudice. She tried, with calm authority, to ask why she had been stopped, to assert the most basic principle that every citizen has the right to know the reason for an arrest. But the officer was not listening. His mind was already made up. To him, she was not a driver on her way to work. She was a suspect. She was guilty until proven innocent. The tension thickened in the air as passing cars slowed, drivers glancing at the unfolding scene. Eleanor stood firm in her composure, but inside she felt the weight of humiliation pressing down on her. This was not just an inconvenience. This was an attack on her dignity, on the very ideals she had sworn to defend. And though she could not know it yet, the situation was far from over. The officer's actions were only the beginning. Backup had already been called. The street was about to become a stage, and her identity, a truth that could silence the accusations in a second, remained hidden, locked away in the purse still sitting on the passenger seat of her car. For now, the story was unfolding as the officer believed it should. A stolen car, a suspect in custody, a victory for law enforcement. But the reality was far more dangerous for him, because the truth had a way of coming to light. And when it did, the balance of power would shift in ways he could never have imagined. The air on the roadside was brisk, carrying with it the faint roar of Chicago traffic rushing past. Judge Eleanor Johnson had pulled her sedan neatly to the curb, its engine idling softly, a picture of order and compliance. Yet the scene that was about to unfold was anything but orderly. From the police cruiser behind her, the officer emerged with brisk, deliberate steps. His uniform was crisp, his badge glinting in the morning light, but his demeanor carried no hint of respect, no acknowledgement of caution. He approached as though the outcome were already written, as though the woman in the silver sedan had already been judged. Eleanor's training as a legal mind told her that every stop, every detainment, should begin with clarity. A clear reason, a presentation of probable cause, a request for documents. But none of those came. Instead, the officer's first words were harsh commands, barked with authority that cut through the noise of the highway. He ordered her to step out of the vehicle immediately. His tone was not inquisitive. It was accusatory, heavy with suspicion that left no room for innocence. He did not ask for her license. He did not ask for registration. He did not ask who she was or where she was headed. To him, none of that mattered. Eleanor hesitated for only a second, her mind racing. She knew her rights. She knew the law. But she also knew the reality. Refusing could escalate the situation further. And so, with quiet dignity, she complied. She opened the door, stepped onto the pavement, and stood tall. The officer wasted no time. He motioned aggressively for her to place her hands behind her back. The cold steel of handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists, each ratchet of the mechanism a jarring reminder that she was no longer being treated as a citizen, but as a criminal. Humiliation burned inside her, though her face betrayed nothing. She had watched countless defendants stand before her in handcuffs, and she had always reminded herself that even in that state, they were innocent until proven guilty. Yet here she was, bound in the same way, denied even the chance to speak her truth. The officer's voice rose again, laced with accusation. He spoke of a stolen car, of matching descriptions, of certainty that she was the one. His words were not questions. They were declarations. To him, she was already guilty. Eleanor tried calmly to speak, to ask what evidence he had, to remind him that the law required more than assumption. But her words were brushed aside, drowned out by his raised voice. He was not listening. His prejudice had already built the case in his mind. Passing drivers slowed, their eyes drawn to the sight of a black woman, impeccably dressed, standing on the roadside in handcuffs while a white officer barked at her. Some shook their heads in silence. Others simply looked away. In that moment, the dignity Eleanor had worked her entire life to uphold felt as though it were being stripped from her, piece by piece, under the glaring eyes of strangers. And yet she stood straight. She did not beg. She did not shout. She carried herself with the same composure she had shown on the bench 1,000 times before. Because Eleanor knew something the officer did not. The truth was on her side. But still, the indignity cut deep. This was not an error in paperwork. This was not a simple misunderstanding. This was a public display of bias, of presumption, of a system being twisted not by the law itself, but by the prejudice of one man sworn to uphold it. The officer guided her roughly toward the hood of her car, still muttering accusations. His tone filled with the confidence of someone who believed he had caught the criminal of the day. Eleanor remained silent now, not out of fear, but because she knew her words would fall on deaf ears. What he did not realize, what he could not imagine, was that the woman he was humiliating was not just another driver. She was a judge, a figure who had sworn the very oath he claimed to serve. And soon, the truth would unravel everything. In the distance, the wail of additional sirens pierced the air. Backup was on its way. Soon, more officers would arrive, more eyes would witness the scene, and the fragile assumptions on which this officer had built his actions would begin to crumble. For now, though Eleanor stood by her car, her wrists bound, her freedom stolen, her dignity tested, and the city of Chicago, moving steadily around her, had no idea that this quiet roadside confrontation was about to explode into a lesson about prejudice, justice, and the power of truth. The metallic bite of the handcuffs pressed into Eleanor Johnson's wrists as she stood by her own car, her body positioned like a criminal on display for the world to see. Cars rolled past slowly, their drivers stealing glances at the scene. Some curious, some pitying, others indifferent. The murmurs of passers-by blended with the noise of the city, but none of them could hear the storm of indignation building within Eleanor's heart. The officer circled her sedan with a swagger that suggested triumph, as though he had single-handedly solved a case. His every movement dripped with presumption, his eyes scanning the vehicle not for truth, but for justification. He wanted his assumptions to be validated, his prejudice to be confirmed. He spoke loudly, not just to her but to the gathering eyes of the public. His words painted her as a thief, a liar, a woman who had been caught red-handed. He described the stolen car from the morning broadcast and insisted this was it, that she was the one. There was no softness in his tone, no room for doubt. Eleanor listened, her silence steady, her posture unbroken. She had spent her life hearing the voices of accusers, prosecutors, and defendants. She knew the difference between truth and theater, and what this officer performed was not the pursuit of justice, but a spectacle of humiliation. He tugged at her arm, guiding her more roughly than necessary, making sure her presence was visible to anyone passing by. It was not enough to detain her. He wanted her shamed. Every movement was calculated to reduce her to an image, a black woman accused, restrained, and silenced. For Eleanor, the sting was not just personal. It was symbolic. She had worked tirelessly to prove that the law could rise above prejudice, that justice could be blind. Yet here she was, bound not by the impartial hand of the law, but by the careless grip of ignorance. She was being judged not for who she was, but for who he believed her to be. The humiliation deepened as the officer's words grew sharper. He accused her of attempting to flee, though she had pulled over calmly. He accused her of fitting the profile, though he had never asked for her identification. He declared her guilty without evidence, without reason, without care. Eleanor's heart ached, not for herself, but for every nameless, faceless person who had stood in her courtroom over the years, claiming they had been treated unfairly by the very system she served. She had always believed in the courts as a place of fairness, where wrongs could be righted. But in that moment, standing on the roadside in handcuffs, she felt what it was like to be unseen, unheard, presumed guilty without cause. And yet, she did not break. She did not shout. She did not plead. She carried herself with the same composure she had worn beneath the black robe of the courtroom. Because Eleanor knew that dignity was something no one could take from her, not even in chains. The officer, however, seemed eager to push further. He called for backup, his voice over the radio laced with certainty. He wanted more witnesses to his arrest, more validation for his hasty judgment. He stood tall, as though expecting praise when his colleagues arrived, as though the story he had crafted in his mind was unshakable. But the cracks were already there, though he could not see them. The silver sedan he had accused of being stolen bore no signs of tampering. Its plates were clean, its documents resting neatly in the glove compartment. In the passenger seat, a leather purse waited quietly, holding the truth that would soon shatter his illusion. And so, Eleanor stood by her car, her wrists bound, her body displayed to the world. The humiliation was heavy, crushing, undeniable. Yet beneath it all was an unshakable core of resilience. She knew something the officer did not. The truth has a way of surfacing. It does not stay buried forever. And when it emerges, it can strip away every falsehood, every prejudice, every careless assumption. In the distance, sirens wailed again. Backup was arriving. Soon, the stage would be crowded with more uniforms, more eyes, more judgments. And soon, the lie at the heart of this roadside spectacle would begin to unravel. The flashing blue and red lights reflected across Eleanor's car windows as additional patrol vehicles pulled up. The sound of sirens cut sharply through the night, then died into silence as doors swung open and more officers stepped onto the street. Their presence drew even more attention. Onlookers slowed, some lifting their phones, others whispering as they watched the scene unfold. The arresting officer straightened with the pride of a man who believed his judgment was about to be vindicated. He gestured toward Eleanor as though presenting his capture, his words laced with certainty. He explained that the vehicle was stolen, that the driver had been attempting to evade, that he had secured the suspect single-handedly. The new arrivals listened, nodding in part, but their eyes wandered to Eleanor. There was something in her bearing calm, composed, unwavering, that unsettled the performance before them. She did not look like someone cowering under guilt or fear. Instead, she carried herself as though she were the one observing them, judging them, weighing their actions as though they were on trial. One of the officers approached the car, shining a flashlight across the license plate. He leaned closer, comparing it with the information received over dispatch. The numbers didn't match. His brow furrowed. He circled around, peering through the glass into the interior. A neat stack of documents sat on the passenger seat, visible even through the glare. Meanwhile, the arresting officer spoke louder, his voice rising as though volume could mask the weakness in his story. He repeated that the suspect matched the profile. He insisted the situation was clear, but clarity was beginning to slip from his grip. Eleanor stood silently, her wrists still bound, her dignity still intact. She did not plead for release. She did not rush to explain herself. She knew that truth, when patient, speaks louder than any defense. The officer who checked the license plate returned, his expression measured. He did not immediately confront his colleague, but his silence weighed heavily in the air. He requested the keys from Eleanor's purse, which sat on the passenger seat. With quiet precision, he opened the glove compartment and pulled out a folder of documents. Registration, insurance, and identification, all in Eleanor Johnson's name. The crowd that had gathered murmured louder now. Some shook their heads. Others filmed discreetly, capturing what was quickly becoming a tale of contradiction. The arresting officer's voice faltered, though he pressed on, clinging desperately to his claims. But the backup officers were not blind. They exchanged glances, their expressions betraying unease. One of them unfolded Eleanor's driver's license, and for a moment, his eyes widened, not at her identity as a citizen, but at her title. There it was in bold lettering, Judge Eleanor M. Johnson. The weight of recognition fell heavy. This was not just any woman on the roadside. This was a figure who had presided over courtrooms, who had sentenced criminals, who had upheld the very laws they were sworn to enforce. And here she stood, humiliated, handcuffed, accused without cause. The silence stretched, thick with tension. The arresting officer tried to recover, his words stumbling into excuses, claims of confusion, of mistaken reports, of erring on the side of caution. But the damage was done. The performance unraveled under the light of truth, and what was left was prejudice laid bare. Eleanor did not gloat. She did not lash out. She stood in the same quiet dignity she had held from the moment the ordeal began. Yet within her chest, her heart beat with both ache and resolve. She had endured this not as a judge, but as a black woman on the streets of Los Angeles. The revelation of her title might shield her from the immediate consequence, but it did not erase the humiliation she had endured, or the reality that countless others suffered the same fate without the armor of status or recognition. The backup officers shifted uneasily. The lead among them stepped forward, his voice softer than the one who had shackled her. He asked that the cuffs be removed. For a long, silent moment, the first officer hesitated. His pride held him hostage, but slowly, begrudgingly, he unlocked the restraints. The sound of metal releasing was small, yet it carried the weight of an entire history of struggle and injustice. Eleanor rubbed her wrists lightly, not to soothe the ache, but to feel the freedom she had never truly lost. The scene was not over. The night was not yet finished. The humiliation she endured would not simply fade because the cuffs were gone. For in that moment, Eleanor knew this was no personal ordeal. It was a mirror, a reflection of the prejudice still woven into the fabric of her city, her country, her time. And though she had been freed, the story was only beginning. The night air in Los Angeles carried a heavy silence after the cuffs were removed. But silence was deceptive. What had unfolded on that roadside was no longer contained to the flashing lights and the circle of uniforms. The world had been watching, through the eyes of passers-by, through the lenses of cell phones, through the quiet hum of social media that never slept. Within hours, clips of the incident began surfacing online. Grainy footage of Judge Eleanor Johnson standing tall despite the restraints spread like wildfire. People saw the way she was treated, heard the certainty with which the officer had accused her, and witnessed the shock ripple through the crowd when her judge ID was discovered. The public reacted swiftly. Some were outraged, voicing anger at the injustice of a woman being humiliated on the side of the road for nothing more than the color of her skin. Others expressed disbelief that such treatment could happen to a figure of authority. If a judge was not safe, then who was? And still others, though fewer, rushed to defend the officer, clinging to the narrative of mistaken identity. But the tide of opinion leaned heavily toward outrage, for the images spoke more truth than words ever could. Eleanor, meanwhile, returned home in the quiet hours of dawn. She sat at her kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of untouched tea, staring at the faint bruises forming around her wrists. She had endured insults and false accusations, yet it was not the words that lingered. It was the weight of the moment, the reminder of how deeply prejudice ran, even against those who stood for the law. Her phone buzzed relentlessly. Calls from colleagues, messages from friends, and inquiries from reporters who had caught wind of the story. But Eleanor chose silence. She knew that in matters like these, every word spoken in haste could be twisted, reshaped, used against her. She had learned long ago that dignity often meant knowing when to speak, and when to let truth stand on its own. Meanwhile, within the police department, the fallout had already begun. The backup officers filed their reports. Their words were careful, but the facts were clear. The vehicle did not match the stolen car description. Eleanor had provided full documentation, and the officers' actions had been hasty, excessive, and rooted in assumption rather than evidence. The chief of police was notified before sunrise. His reaction was grim, not because he doubted what had occurred, but because he understood what it meant for the department's reputation. In an era where every misstep was magnified, this was no small storm. It was a hurricane already brewing in the public eye. By midday, news outlets were running the headline, "Black female judge wrongfully accused and handcuffed by LAPD officer." Eleanor's image was everywhere, her poised face on the roadside, her quiet dignity shining through humiliation. Commentators debated, community leaders spoke out, and civil rights advocates rallied behind her, framing the incident as not just an isolated act of misconduct, but a symptom of something larger and more dangerous. At the courthouse, whispers filled the halls. Colleagues who had always admired Eleanor's fairness now looked at her with a mix of sorrow and pride. They saw not only a judge, but a woman who had been forced to experience firsthand the very injustices she had dedicated her career to dismantling. Yet Eleanor herself did not seek the spotlight. She went about her duties quietly, though the weight of the ordeal lingered. Every gavel strike in her courtroom felt heavier, every ruling more significant, for she now carried with her the knowledge of what it meant to stand on the other side of the law's gaze. The officer, meanwhile, was placed on immediate suspension. An internal investigation was launched. His name was withheld at first, but soon leaked, and with it came scrutiny of his past complaints, his record, and his behavior on duty. Patterns emerged, small, overlooked incidents that now painted a larger picture of bias. And so the court of public opinion rendered its own verdict long before the official one could be delivered. The city was stirred, the people were speaking, and the demand for accountability grew louder with each passing hour. But Eleanor knew that justice could not rest on opinion alone. Justice required process, proof, and consequence. And as the sun set that evening, casting long shadows across her living room floor, she made a quiet vow. This was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a fight, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever stood on the roadside, unseen, unheard, unjustly accused. The following days unfolded with a weight that neither Eleanor nor the city could ignore. The video footage of her wrongful arrest had spread across the nation, sparking conversations far beyond Los Angeles. What began as a single officer's prejudice had ignited a broader debate on accountability, fairness, and the painful reality of racial profiling in modern policing. Inside the police department, the investigation moved swiftly. The facts were irrefutable. The vehicle did not match the description of the stolen car. No proper identification check had been performed before the arrest, and the officer had acted with hostility unbecoming of his badge. Internal Affairs combed through his history and discovered that this was not the first complaint lodged against him. Minor infractions that had once been overlooked now returned like ghosts, painting a portrait of a man who had let bias govern his judgment too many times. The chief of police addressed the media with a carefully measured tone. He acknowledged the seriousness of the incident, promised full transparency, and assured the public that corrective action would be taken. But for many, those words rang hollow. They had heard them before. Promises without accountability had long been the language of cover-ups. This time, however, there was no covering what the world had already seen. The officer was placed on indefinite suspension, pending disciplinary hearings. Within weeks, the department announced his termination and the possibility of criminal charges for misconduct. The decision sent ripples through the ranks. For the first time in years, officers felt the weight of accountability pressed more firmly against their shoulders. Eleanor, meanwhile, found herself in an unusual position. She had not sought publicity, but her silence was interpreted as strength. Community groups reached out, asking her to speak at forums, rallies, and events. Civil rights leaders praised her composure. Young black women, especially, looked to her as proof that dignity could withstand even the harshest of humiliations. At first, she hesitated. She was, after all, a judge bound by restraint, committed to impartiality. Yet she could not deny the responsibility that had been thrust upon her. Her ordeal was no longer just her own. It was a symbol of a struggle shared by countless others who lacked the platform to be heard. When she finally agreed to speak, her words carried the gravity of lived truth. Standing before a crowd gathered in a local community center, she told them not of anger, but of resilience. She reminded them that justice was not a gift to be handed down. It was a right to be upheld. She spoke of the humiliation she endured, but also of the unshakable belief that the law, though flawed in practice, was still the path to equality if held accountable to its highest ideals. Her speech did not fan the flames of rage. Instead, it stoked the fire of resolve. The people left not with bitterness, but with purpose. They saw in her not just a victim of prejudice, but a fighter who had faced it head-on and remained unbroken. In the days that followed, policy discussions began to surface. City officials debated new training programs, accountability measures, and the strengthening of oversight boards. What had happened to Eleanor Johnson had forced a reckoning that could not be swept aside. The system had been embarrassed, exposed, and challenged to improve. As for the officer, his regret came too late. He had been stripped of his badge, the symbol of authority he had once wielded so carelessly. Where once he stood tall in uniform, he now faced the quiet shame of a man whose prejudice had cost him his career. His regret was not just for his actions, but for the realization that he had been blind to the humanity before him. Justice, Eleanor believed, was not vengeance. It was accountability. And as she sat in her chambers weeks later, reflecting on the ordeal, she understood that accountability had finally taken root. It did not erase the pain of that night, nor did it undo the humiliation. But it sent a message that no one, not even those sworn to uphold the law, was above it. And for the first time since the ordeal began, Eleanor felt a quiet satisfaction, not for her own vindication, but for the precedent it had set. Her struggle had not been in vain. Months passed, yet the memory of that night on the roadside never left Eleanor. The bruises on her wrists had faded long ago, but the invisible scars, the indignity, the weight of assumption, the sting of being judged by the color of her skin rather than the content of her character remained. But those scars did not weaken her. They became her strength. Her story had traveled far beyond Los Angeles. It was told in classrooms, in community centers, in city halls across the country. Law students dissected it as a case study on racial bias and accountability. Activists cited it as a rallying cry. Mothers whispered it to their daughters, telling them to stand tall, no matter who tried to make them feel small. Eleanor herself continued her work as a judge with the same loyalty to justice she had always carried. Yet something within her had shifted. Each time she entered the courtroom, she did so with a sharper clarity, a deeper understanding of what it meant to sit on both sides of the law. She was no longer only the one who passed judgment. She was also the one who had endured it. And she used that experience not as bitterness, but as wisdom. She listened more carefully to the accused. She scrutinized the evidence more thoroughly. She reminded every officer and attorney who entered her courtroom that justice was not about appearances, but about truth. The officer who had humiliated her faded into obscurity, his regret swallowed by the consequences of his own actions. Yet Eleanor did not let his name be the focus. To her, the story was never about one man's prejudice. It was about a system that too often allowed prejudice to thrive unchecked. Her true vindication came not in his downfall, but in the reforms that began to sprout from the ashes of that night. New training protocols were introduced. Oversight committees gained more authority. And most importantly, conversations that had long been ignored were finally given space to grow. But perhaps Eleanor's greatest legacy was quieter, more personal. It was the young woman who approached her after a community event, tears brimming in her eyes, saying, "Because of you, I want to become a judge." It was the mother who wrote her a letter, explaining that her teenage son now believed the law could be a shield rather than only a sword. It was the countless voices who found strength in her story, realizing they were not alone. Eleanor knew that progress was slow, fragile, and imperfect. She knew that her story was only one among thousands, and that for every video that went viral, countless others went unseen. But she also knew that every step toward justice, no matter how small, was worth taking. On a quiet evening months later, she stood at her window overlooking the city of Los Angeles. The skyline shimmered with light, alive with possibility. She thought of her parents, who had raised her to believe in dignity and hard work. She thought of the ancestors who had endured far greater trials so that she could stand where she stood. And she thought of the law not as an abstract set of rules, but as a living promise. A promise that demanded constant vigilance, constant accountability, constant faith. She whispered to herself, not in bitterness, but in resolve, "Justice is equal for everyone, and as long as I live, I will make sure it remains so." The night stretched on, but Eleanor felt no fear of it, for in the darkness, she carried her own light, a light of struggle, strength, and survival, a light that could not be dimmed by prejudice, by humiliation, or by hate. And so her story lived on, not as a tale of despair, but as a legacy of justice. A reminder that even in the face of injustice, dignity endures, truth prevails, and equality remains a fight worth waging.